Hello everyone, I'm Craig A. Woodward.
And I'm James A. Moores.
I'm the Idiot, and he's the Bohemian, and even if this is your first time here, welcome back to the Broken Quill. Our topic today is world building once more. I previously did an episode on this regarding epic fantasy and high fantasy specifically, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend giving it a look. The link is in the description. But today, as you can see, James will be joining me as we dive into different kinds of world building, whether this be hardcore world building or softcore or different genres, fantasy world building versus sci-fi, the differences, pros, cons, things of the like. Well, like always, we should probably define what we mean. So, James, what would you consider the differences between softcore world building and hardcore world building?
Well, as a science fiction writer, I fall back on the two basic denotations of that genre, and that is hardcore and softcore. In regards to sci-fi, we're talking about what the reader expects from their experience. In hardcore science fiction, they want the story to be accurate to modern science with no magic boxes. They expect the novel to contain long moments of scientific exposition where the science is explained and the math shown, showing their long division, as it were. People read softcore for the adventure, for the story, for the characters and the drama. I see softcore and hardcore world building in much the same way. When a reader picks up an epic fantasy book, they expect to read something with a highly detailed world. They are reading for those interactions, the many kingdoms, the detailed magic systems, the massive interconnected world. In a softcore fantasy novel, they are interested in the characters, the fantastical magic and monsters and drama.
I can agree with that, but I also find that the fantasy side tends to be a little bit more forgiving. For example, you're right that in epic fantasy, hardcore world building is a must. As I explained in my previous video, the average length of an epic fantasy is 150,000 words plus. That's a long time to spend in a world, so it has to be detailed. However, not every inch of it has to be, specifically magic systems. Lord of the Rings, for example, is an epic fantasy with a hardcore world, but a softcore magic system. But to my understanding, science fiction is much less forgiving. Is that true?
Not always. If you're working on a hardcore system, it's very unforgiving, but that's not really a world-building issue. Most hardcore science fiction novels are simply set in our world at our time. We can certainly see that Larry Niven's Ringworld is a hardcore science fiction novel with hardcore world building, whereas Arthur C. Clarke's Space Odyssey series has very little world building. We know next to nothing about the monoliths, and why they are truly doing what they are doing. But in the Ringworld series, the whole scape of the Ringworld, political systems, mechanical organizations, guilds, so on and so forth, are detailed for us. The same with Joe Haldeman's Forever War. The novel is a hardcore science fiction novel, and the key thing we, the reader, are meant to take away from it is how the world changes every time he goes back to Earth from the battlefield. So we see how political landscapes change, views of sex, and even what makes us human change. This is true for softcore science fiction as well. Ian M. Banks, in his seminal culture series, rarely gives us hard and fast definitions of what the culture is or what the makeup or organization of special circumstances is. So it is a fairly softcore world. The Expanse by James S.A. Corey, on the other hand, is very detailed in its world. We know a great deal about the conflicts between Earth and Mars, the Outworld Planets Alliance, and so on, yet it's a softcore science fiction story.
So if it's not about how forgiving they are, then what do you think are the differences between sci-fi and fantasy world building? One major difference that I've personally noticed is something that you touched on before, the concept of, in science fiction, hardcore lacking magic boxes. Magic systems in fantasy, though, even those that use a hardcore magic system, actually do allow the concept of a magic box. They allow for the forgiveness of the concept of magic in the first place. It is a thing and can be used. The hardcore aspect is in how it's used, what can be done with it, what are the rules. But hardcore sci-fi, to my understanding, gives no quarter.
Well, that's why it's fantasy. Though, in science fiction, as Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I would contend, however, that in science fiction, any of the magic needs to be grounded in that advanced technology, so it is less forgiving in that way, yes. But firstly, I'd like to make it clear for our audience that hardcore science fiction and softcore science fiction are not hardcore world or softcore world building. They're separate things. That being said, when dealing with hardcore science fiction specifically, the science, the math, it has to be right. It has to be more than realistic. It has to be correct. Most hardcore sci-fi sticks to just humans, usually close to our time now, like The Martian, for instance. So for those novels, it's easy to craft a hardcore world because your world is just our world. What is the interplay between nations in The Martian? Well, it's just 15 years in the future. I mean, we can see that from our doorstep. So how are the national politics? Just turn on the news. It's doubtful they've changed that much by the time period. So it's kind of cheating in world building. But what about the distant future? Well, Seven Eves, by the brilliant Neil Stephenson, shows us a highly detailed world where we both have a recent Earth with current political machinations, and then pick up 5,000 years into the future, where a new humanity spreads out in a myriad of space stations around the Earth, each with their own alliances and interactions, depending on the different peoples who make up those stations. He even provides a map. So the bounds that it must be perfectly scientifically accurate forces Stephenson to create a world accurate to that science, and this world shows that. But you might ask me, what about aliens?
I would, and I will. What about aliens?
It's not aliens. Okay, it's aliens. In Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle's The Mote in God's Eye, we have one of the few examples of true hardcore science fiction aliens. Most aliens in hardcore usually fall around the ones we see in Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time. The aliens aren't really aliens, just an advanced form of Earth-based life. The Motes, however, as they are called, are a unique alien species with a large arm connected to the side of their heads. The majority of the book explores the Motes, their culture, politics, why they look the way they do, their spacefaring abilities. It's all painstakingly done, and it's probably the only true hardcore sci-fi aliens out there. It's not the only one, mind you, but it's one of the best, hands down. So by that way, yes, hardcore science fiction is very restrictive for your world building. Aliens can be hard, if not non-existent, and remembering that your audience is here for the science, you're going to be spending a lot of time discussing, driving, and pushing them. Softcore science fiction, on the other hand, you can go hog wild. If you want a giant talking goldfish to yell "it's a trap" on a shrimp platter starship, then you should go right ahead. It'd be great, and I think we'd all love it. My jest. If you want to go into deep world building with aliens in softcore, then go ahead. We know more about the Klingons than any other race in science fiction, but to ignore the fact that they are just an allegory for Russia or post-world Japan would be to ignore the point of the whole thing. And therein lies the point. Hardcore, we want to know what it is about these aliens that make them real. In softcore, we ask, what can these aliens show us about ourselves?
So you believe the difference between sci-fi and fantasy in hardcore and softcore world building is in the allegory? I think there's something to that. A lot of allegory within fantasy is about our past, our actions, our tensions, our politics, our emotions. Lord of the Rings is about war. The Black Magician trilogy is about censorship and fear of the unknown, and his Dark Materials is about innocence and corrupting religions. In mind of that, what kind of allegory does the Society of the Motes say?
It doesn't. It's not an allegory. I mean, there's probably something there about violence or trusting your neighbors or something of that nature, but they aren't an allegory. They are real. The Chinese are not an allegory. The British are not an allegory. They are real peoples with their own beliefs, desires, and motivations. They are sometimes good people, sometimes bad people. The Motes are like this. They're real. They have their own motivations, their own desires, and they aren't there to show us, the reader, how we should be a better person. If you take Star Trek VI, for instance, the explosion of Praxis is obviously the Chernobyl explosion. At the first, the Russians tried to hide it, but eventually had to give in to world pressures, and eventually became the catalyst for the end of the Cold War, which would happen between 3 and 5 years later, depending on the ending event. But we can obviously see what Star Trek is doing, using Kirk's racism and making him learn to give up his hatred and save the Klingons is a mirror to the West's distrust of the Russians and finally putting that aside to become, if not friends, not really enemies and sometimes allies. This allegory cannot work in hardcore science fiction. You have to twist your chosen alien around so much that forcing a massive natural disaster and Earth-style regime on them would seem out of place. Unrealistic. People would roll their eyes saying, "Oh, you're just making these aliens Russia, so they aren't real. They're just a part of your literary agenda." You can say different things about your hardcore aliens, you can show things about your human protagonists/antagonists, but you can't really turn them into an allegory. It won't work in a hardcore science fiction system.
Okay, so if it's not the allegory, then you're saying it's in the intention. Hardcore sci-fi, as you've said, to my understanding, is about intending to make something real. And if it's an allegory of something else, then you haven't actually done that. But in fantasy, you can have hardcore world building and it still be allegory. Once more, Lord of the Rings proves this. So if we're talking the intention of why something is made, how is also a fun place to start. I did a whole video on building an epic fantasy world, but what about yourself and your own books? How did you build those? Where did you start?
You seem to have misunderstood me a little, and I think that's probably my fault, and the fault of the nomenclature here. Apologies, viewers. Let me try and clear this up a little. Hardcore science fiction does not need hardcore world building, and softcore science fiction does not need softcore world building. For example, Star Trek is a softcore science fiction world. There are magic boxes galore, like the Transporter, or the myriad of alien gods we meet throughout the series, like Q or Tulane. How fast warp speed it changes from series to series, and exactly how most of the ships function is a mystery to us. Yet, we are filled to the brim with hardcore world elements. We know a great deal of how the Klingon Empire is set up, its relations with the highly detailed Romulan Star Empire. We understand every part of the Bajoran occupation by the Cardassians and why the Federation didn't get involved in that. We understand the politics, the machinations, the interplay, and we even have maps of the galactic powers. Softcore science fiction, hardcore world building. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I also believe that you utilize this in your own stories, don't you? So, in light of this, I pass the previous question to you again. If you're approaching from a sci-fi angle, where do you start when building an empire?
Personally, I start with the story. I write softcore science fiction. I think I write with a bit of a realistic veneer, so I'm in the same edifice as James S.A. Corey. Realistic, but a magic box or two and a focus on character and story never hurt anybody. My characters talk to me, I am their scribe. I write down what they say, and if they are more interested in their world, I get a hardcore world. If they tell me their adventures, I tend to get a softcore. I don't build a world, the world builds itself. But I don't set out to tell hardcore worlds or softcore worlds. In my youth, I built very expansive worlds, ones that definitely fall into the hardcore world building. I set things up similar to you spoke in your video, building the world from the ground up. But when it came to my first novel, A Whale of Stars, I definitely went for a softcore world. I think there are elements of hardcore in there, but I feel it's on the softer side. The story needs what it needs. If it needs a hardcore world, then give it a hardcore world. If it needs a softcore, then give it softcore. Is that good advice, or am I being too much of a bohemian again?
You're always a bohemian, but it's never too much.
Oh, that's almost sweet.
Don't get used to it.
Oh, don't worry. I won't, Prince Mushkin. I suppose if I'm going to give advice to any budding science fiction authors that may be listening that want to create a hardcore science fiction world, it would be to start with the familiar. Figure out Earth. Where did it go from now? How did we answer the problems of today and then move out into bigger questions? How did we get to space? How did we start our interstellar civilization? What happened when we encountered our first aliens? Did we to war like Mass Effect and the First Contact War, or did we forge peace and an alliance with the world span hundreds of years like Earth and Vulcan in Star Trek? And from there, realize your world from the disparate parts. Add aliens to color your world and give it spice, and feel where your adventure takes you.
I think that's some great advice. But before we bring this to a close, we still have one last port of call. Pros and cons. What are the pros and cons of hardcore and softcore world building as it pertains to each genre? I think I'll go first. In fantasy, softcore world building allows you to explore anything you want. The movie Labyrinth doesn't explain anything. The main character is simply sent onto fantastical trials full of beautiful imagery, allegory, and craziness. It doesn't have to be crazy, of course, but Alice in Wonderland would hardly be the same if the world made sense. Softcore in fantasy is freeing. It's a shackles-off approach that allows you to maintain the wonder and devastating depths that you can achieve without being too bogged down by the details. The con of this, though, is that without said details, you do become limited on the kind of subjects you can dive into, or at least the kind of depth that you can give. Alice in Wonderland might have something to say about corruption within the monarchy, but it's hardly his dark materials in its political interplay. As for hardcore pros and cons, its con would be its inability to dive into the kind of depths that absurdity allows. The chaos of imagination can become stifled by the required voice of reason in a hardcore world. But the pro is that the world it becomes a world that you can breathe in, a world that you can live in and explore and discover in ways that allow it to fall into place organically rather than messily. So, what about sci-fi, James?
Well, in science fiction, we're already grounded, so I'm going to be bold and say that as far as science fiction is concerned, there are no pros, there are no cons. Yes, if you're writing a small story and you want to focus on characters and plot with a heavy allegorical message, it's going to be hard to work in hardcore elements. But there's no reason why you can't. The level of detail you want to put into your story is dependent on you. A story of a giant galactic war is going to need hardcore elements, or it's not going to make sense. The story of a singular starship's race across the universe to deliver a sensitive message is going to feel slow if you put in a lot of world building. But maybe you want it to be slow. Maybe you want the reader to get every piece of detail as to why this singular thing is so important. Or maybe you just want an adventure. For you, sci-fi writer, hardcore world building, softcore world building is not an imperative. It changes what you write, not how you write it. It is a tool. Wield it.
Well said. And probably a good place to end it. I hope this has been interesting, and if so, let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. I'm Craig A. Woodward.
I'm James A. Moores.
And we look forward to seeing you next time on The Broken Quill.